So, Gabe, let me start with you. The significance of this here today. The Prime Minister saying that he is essentially resigning not only as leader of his party, but as Prime Minister, and that this is going to be a status quo. He'll stay in charge until the 24th of March.
Yeah, that's right, Jose. Look, hugely significant. Our key ally to the north, Prime Minister Trudeau, resigning, stepping down as party leader now. And this has huge implications for the future Trump administration. As we had just been discussing, President-elect Trump threatening that 25% tariff against Canada and wanting to see real changes in the way Canada treats its neighbor to the south. And President-elect Trump has mocked Prime Minister Trudeau. And Trudeau has been a leader that in some ways has faced a lot of issues that are similar to what President Biden has faced here at home. Inflation, dismal poll numbers. And President Biden indeed stepped aside several months ago. Now it appears that Prime Minister Trudeau is suffering that, bowing to that same sort of pressure, this populist backlash, really, that we've been seeing with leaders across the world. So President-elect Trump, Jose, has voiced frustration and about his view and how the U.S. has subsidized Canada. He wants to see more action on immigration. And in fact, Prime Minister Trudeau just several weeks ago bowed to pressure from the president-elect and announced there would be more funding for some immigration measures, an immigration crackdown that Canada, essentially bowed to pressure from President-elect Trump. But Trump himself, he met with Prime Minister Trudeau just several weeks ago in late November, early December, and just several days after that mocked him on social media, calling him the governor of the 51st state of Canada. So certainly some very strained relations there. We, of course, don't have a reaction from the current White House just yet. After this announcement, we're out to them to see if there might be any immediate reaction. But a very positive relationship between President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau. They had just spoken just several weeks ago on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Brazil. But certainly that breaking news, the Prime Minister just now announcing that he will step down as the party leader, Jose.
Yeah. Yeah, and Peter, there is a question I guess many would have as to why now, right? I mean, Parliament is not in session in Canada until the month of March. There is clearly there has been a deterioration of the Prime Minister's support within his own political party, also the party that has joined to make the possibility of a majority in Parliament there in Canada. That support has essentially fizzled out. But then you do see that Trump mocking Trudeau in recent weeks. Trudeau caught on a microphone a few years ago mocking Trump when Trump was president. How do you think the president-elect is likely to view this announcement?
Well, no doubt he will consider himself to be responsible because he is responsible for all things that he likes and not responsible for anything he doesn't like. And he will no doubt, I'm sure, take credit for this and crow about this and say this is a result of Trudeau's terrible relationship that he had with him, Trump, and that therefore he's paying a price for not being nicer to Trump. That's the way he will see this. That's the way he normally casts these kinds of things. Of course, this goes beyond Trump. Trump is definitely a factor. But Trudeau's political standing, his ground had shifted beneath him long before Trump's, re-election in November. He has once been, of course, a shining star in the political firmament in Canada, but people have long since lost their faith in him. His government, as you say, was having a hard time keeping that coalition together. Chrystia Freeland, his trusted deputy, resigned with a blast at his leadership, which was, I think, a devastating blow for him. And his time clearly was over. He's facing a political circumstance at home that didn't sustain a continued leadership, and he's come to recognize that and acknowledge that today.
Yeah, I mean, there's no way that he could continue in power going forward after March 24th with the NDP leader and the MDP completely out of that coalition that they needed and required in order for him to stay in power. But Senator, this change in leadership, what do you think the repercussions of that are going to be as we go forward? We're talking about the 24th of March, at least before anything can change in Canada. That's already Trump 2 in power. How do you think that change is going to represent any kind of options or possibilities going forward for example, issue of USMC, of, tariffs going forward from the United States towards Canada?
I mean, I think that the prime minister just put sovereignty on the ballot. And he knew that he was not the person to carry that banner. And you say, why now? I think he watched what happened in this country when an unpopular president stayed too long and what that meant for the Democratic Party and what that could mean for the Liberal Party. One thing that people are forgetting is the USMCA, which was the NAFTA replacement, actually requires a renegotiation. And the irony of the president, the future president, basically complaining about the relationship is he negotiated, his administration negotiated the USMCA. And there's no more important two trading partners for the United States than Canada and Mexico. And so for a state like mine, North Dakota, that relationship with Canada is critical to our economy. And so I think Trump's never really understood the interaction on this continent between these countries. And for him to criticize and basically say, you're taking advantage of us, he negotiated a bad deal. The guy who is the art of the deal did a bad deal, I guess. And so I think for Justin Trudeau and for the Liberal Party, they needed this change in order to maintain some semblance of power in Canada. But I also think that sovereignty, which is critical to the Canadian people, now is on the ballot. When Trump says you're going to be the 51st state, that relationship will be a key political talking point, I think, during this election.
Yeah, I mean, and Peter, the fact is that UMCA, with good and bad, was certainly a step forward for what was in existence before UMCA. And I'm just wondering, and as the senator is saying, I mean, this is a time when things have to be renegotiated. Is this an opening for a stronger USMCA going forward?
Well, we'll see. I mean, what we now have, of course, is a period of turmoil and uncertainty in Canada for a little while, because whoever will take over for Trudeau, in 6 weeks or whatever it is, will then have to prepare for domestic elections later in the year. And that means that it will be, a very politically fraught moment to make a new deal with the United States. You're going to want to show your toughness on behalf of Canada. At the same time, you don't want the negative repercussions that could come from a Trump tariff war against our northern neighbors. So it's a very fraught moment, I think, for whoever it is steps in at this point as leader, and I think that it makes it unpredictable.
Now, you might not remember this, but Trump's first rally of the 2024 campaign was held in Waco, Texas, the site of a deadly standoff between federal agents and a religious cult in 1993. That was not a coincidental choice. And at the beginning of that very same rally, Trump put his hand over his heart as a rendition of the national anthem, sung by a choir of imprisoned rioters, blared over the speakers. And that kicked off an effort to completely rewrite history that lasted the entire campaign. I mean, Trump started referring to the insurrectionists as political prisoners, as hostages, as patriots of all things. He vowed to pardon them if and when he returned to office. And we were all left to wonder which people he meant exactly when he said that, which he said repeatedly. I mean, did he mean David Dempsey, who prosecutors called political violence personified, who attacked officers with flagpoles, crutches, pepper spray, broken furniture in his own hands and feet? Did he mean Daniel Ball, who hurled an explosive device into a tunnel packed with police officers trying to fend off the mob? Or did he mean Thomas Webster, a retired police officer himself who tackled a member of the Capitol Police, attacked him with a flagpole, and tried to remove his helmet and gas mask? Or maybe he meant Daniel Rodriguez, who drove a stun gun into the neck of Officer Michael Fanone. Donald Trump says those people are political prisoners and hostages and patriots. And when he returns to office in 2 weeks, he may well pardon each and every one of them. And that's just the tip of the whitewashing spear. Trump is also stacking his cabinet with election deniers. One of the architects of the plot to steal the election was just reelected Speaker of the House. Some lawmakers are bringing insurrectionists as their guests to the inauguration. And it's hard to imagine any of that would be happening without Trump, the leader of the Republican Party, the president-elect, embracing the role of the people who attacked the Capitol 4 years ago. Now, with all of that I just outlined, there is a natural inclination to feel pissed off and frustrated that the system failed in some way. And I've done my own reflection on that over the last few years. Believe me, I get it. I look back at the months after January 6th as President Biden was preparing to take office, as we were all working to get Judge Merrick Garland confirmed as Attorney General. Now, this is a man who has an unassailable resume and viewed the job as it should be viewed, through the prism of the law and history. But I do wonder if at that moment in history, he was the right choice for the job. Yes, the Justice Department has charged about 1,500 people for their role that day. But what about the guy who sparked it all? The guy walking around free and hosting events for election deniers at Mar-a-Lago in the weeks before his inauguration. Would a different attorney general have acted sooner? Would that have made any difference? We'll never really know, but I do wonder. I also look back at the strategy of not speaking out about Trump's impeachment from the White House podium, not speaking enough about the impact his rhetoric had on the rise in political violence, and wonder whether that was the right strategy for that moment in history. Yes, it was done with absolutely the right intention, to attempt to bring the country together, to move forward, and to try to work together even with people you disagree with to get things done. But I wonder if it also gave space for people to forget, to get numb to the impact of one man's power, and what could happen if he was given it again. So those are a couple of my own personal reflections. And look, we can't predict the future, just like none of us can change the past. But we do know that history has a tendency to repeat, which is why we have to keep the memory of the worst days alive. It's why we need to reflect and to question the choices that we all made along the way. It's why we need to change our approach when warranted. It's why we need to keep defending the things that matter, even when the politics might be murky. Because it isn't always about politics. It's not. Sometimes it's just about what's right. I mean, today the sitting vice president of the United States certified the election of the man who defeated her, the man she repeatedly called, accurately, a threat to democracy.
The votes for President of the United States are as follows. Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida has received 312 votes. Kamala D. Harris Kamala D. Harris of the state of California has received 226 votes.
That must have felt, horrible. But the peaceful transfer of power, even after a hard-fought campaign, is part of what keeps a democracy functioning. It's also what's right. And while we should never forget what happened 4 years ago, and we're going to talk about it tonight a lot, we can all do our part to try and make sure it never happens again. Joining me now is Congressman Jamie Raskin. He led the second impeachment trial of Donald Trump, served on the January 6th House Select Committee, and he has continued to keep the memory of January 6th alive, raising all of the important questions. It's great to see you. There's no one I wanted to talk to more than you today. You are just always so thoughtful and reflective in moments when people need to hear it. So I just outlined why I think it's important to remember the events of that day and what it's important to remember about it. But as you've reflected on it, what do you hope people remember?
Well, I hope people remember the valor and the bravery of our officers, like Sergeant Gonell, who I think is going to visit with you, and Harry Dunn, and hundreds of officers who put themselves between the Capitol, the Congress, the Vice President, and a rampaging mob of thousands who had been sent by Donald Trump to try to overturn a presidential election. And those people were really on the front lines. And as long as we remember them and their sacrifice and their injuries and the fact that their lives and their families have been turned upside down, we won't forget that this was a real event. Mm-hmm. They're not going to be able to shroud it in all kinds of right-wing conspiracy theory and myths. But when I was sitting there today, Jen, I was thinking a lot about the Electoral College. This is an 18th century institution that's very creaky. It's given us 5 popular vote losers in our history twice in this century, George W. Bush and Donald Trump, and that fundamentally altered the trajectory of our politics. It marginalizes the vast majority of the American people. It's very weird. We've gotten conditioned to it, but strange to have a presidential election that comes down immediately to 6 or 7 states, and everybody else is just watching what happens in Pennsylvania and Georgia and Arizona. You know, why don't we have an election for president like an election for representative or senator or mayor or governor? Whoever gets the most votes wins. And you don't have to have a vice president who's in the race, whether that's Kamala Harris or I think I remember Al Gore was in the same situation or Richard Nixon was in that situation, counting the Electoral College votes. And people don't even understand it anymore. Like our Republican colleagues today, they were cheering and stomping their feet and acting like it was the Republican National Convention. Our job there was just to be counting the votes. But people don't fundamentally understand it. And it's time for a refresh. And I think this is a good opportunity to do it. I mean, Donald Trump, he's very proud of the fact that he won the popular vote by 3 million votes, the way that Joe Biden was proud of the fact that he won by 7 million votes 4 years ago. Okay, why don't we all agree just to have a popular vote for election and move away from a dangerous and manipulable electoral college system?
Hopefully it's not always able to be manipulated, but I think a lot of people share your view on the Electoral College versus the popular vote. Let me ask you about a clip. I just played the clip of the vice president. You referenced this, certifying the election, something others have done in history. Usually just normal par for the course, but feels hard to watch a bit in this moment, given the role Trump played 4 years ago. What was going through your head when you were watching?
Well, it's a bitter
today?
pill to swallow. I mean, we were there on the floor, the Democrats acting as constitutional patriots. We are demonstrating our fidelity to the constitutional process as it's written. And we did the right thing in that sense. But it was a very bitter pill to swallow, given that 4 years ago, when they faced electoral defeat, 306 to 232 in the Electoral College, by more than 7 million votes in the popular vote, the Republicans under Donald Trump mobilized a violent insurrection to try to effectuate a backroom political coup against the vice president. They were trying to force Mike Pence to unilaterally declare that the Electoral College votes coming from Michigan and Wisconsin and Georgia and Arizona would be voided out, and either Trump would just be declared the president or they would kick the whole thing into the House of Representatives for a so-called contingent election under the 12th Amendment, where they knew we would be voting not on the basis of one member, one vote, how we usually vote, but rather one state, one vote. This is all part of the arcane, intricate architecture of the Electoral College that most people haven't studied. And most people think that you go and you just vote and whoever gets the most votes wins. And that's not what's taking place under the Electoral College. And so there are a lot of weaknesses and perils in this process. And I would think now that we've had 2 popular vote winners, one from each party back to back, we could all agree now is the time to move forward and to pick the president the way we pick everybody else on the basis of whoever gets the most votes.
Sounds very rational, doesn't it? A good discussion to be had. Let me ask you, to the point of, we've been talking a little bit about rewriting history and the importance of fighting back against that. And today, the lawyer for Enrico Tarrio, who's serving 22 years, filed an official request for a pardon. Do you think Trump will pardon him?
Look, the pardons have been used for 3 kinds of cases, as far as I can tell from reading the decisions on it. One is if a person is actually innocent and new information turns up. 2 is if there was some kind of profound procedural miscarriage of justice. 3 is if the person was guilty, but they're reformed and rehabilitated. Well, I don't hear anybody saying that the people we see on all these video clips were actually innocent, and nobody has identified any procedural miscarriage of justice. So I think Donald Trump is basically saying, when he wants to pardon all of these people, that they are reformed and they're rehabilitated and they do not constitute a danger to the public safety today. Is that true or is that not true? Well, we should go through each one of these cases. That's why there's a pardon attorney at the Department of Justice. But if Donald Trump doesn't want to wait for the pardon attorney in the Department of Justice to actually go through the cases and make a recommendation, he is placing his personal seal of approval, vouching for each of these people as he pardons them, which means he essentially becomes responsible for whatever happens with them. And have they been reformed? Have they been rehabilitated? Donald Trump should tell America why he thinks that someone who smashes a police officer over the head with a stick or a baseball bat or a Confederate battle flag actually belongs on the streets. Are they no longer a danger to police officers? Are they no longer a danger to federal, state, or local government or law enforcement officials? Who knows? But that's why this is a radically unprecedented and novel situation we're in. He's pardoning people that he sent to the Capitol to go and fight like hell, or we wouldn't have a country anymore. And I understand politically the logic of why he would do it, but legally and morally, I don't understand the logic of it unless he's willing to vouch for each of these people.
So that's one thing to know about that video of what happened that day in Coral Gables. The guy shooting the video, the guy screaming at Nancy Pelosi, filming people pounding on the door to try to intimidate her, saying the Proud Boys are there. That guy is now in prison for trying to overthrow the U.S. government. But the other thing to know about that video is that the guy who he's actually filming doing the pounding on the door, this guy right here in the red circle, he has just been named by Donald Trump as his choice to be the next U.S. ambassador to the nation of Panama. Because apparently that is what our country is looking for in an ambassador now. Will you make yourself a physical menace for Donald Trump? Now, that man who's now Donald Trump's ambassador pick, after this happened in Coral Gables, he later defended his conduct there, saying he was just exercising his right to protest. At the time it happened, though, in 2018, Republicans were quite embarrassed by this. The head of the Miami-Dade Republican Party apologized for being there, distanced himself from the Proud Boys. Other Republicans, including Florida Senator Marco Rubio, condemned the action, said Republicans should never do anything physically intimidating like this. Well, now Marco Rubio is about to be nominated to be Donald Trump's Secretary of State, where the guy pounding bloody murder on the door to try to scare Nancy Pelosi and smiling up at Enrique Tarrio when he says, it's the Proud Boys in here, that guy will be reporting to Marco Rubio as one of America's next U.S. ambassadors. And the reason that's repellent, the reason that is it's sort of instinctually repulsive to us is because there's supposed to be a sharp line that keeps violent intimidation on one side of the line and politics on the other, and never the twain shall meet. In a democratic country, those things are supposed to be separate. And so today, January 6th, the certification of the last presidential election happened in Washington, and it just happened ministerially and ceremonially like it's supposed to. And that contrast with what happened today versus what happened 4 years ago makes clear the profound difference between the two parties, right? Had Democrats won the presidential election this year, the whole country openly expected and was preparing for Republicans to go into violent, if not armed, revolt. But because instead Republicans won, everyone expected, and in fact we saw today, that Democrats would peacefully accept and participate in the transfer of power. And when a whole country expects guaranteed violence if one side loses in an electoral contest, then the two political parties in that contest are no longer competing in Democratic terms anymore. One of those parties is a small d and capital D Democratic Party. The other party is something else. So that is part of what we are contending with on this January 6th. How do we ever get our democracy back now? Because we have, in effect, lost it. How do we ever get back to competition in democratic terms? Which means specifically, how do we get the Republican Party and the Trumpist right to no longer see physical force and armed conflict as the way they're going to get their way and hold power? One big step backwards from that as a goal will be Trump's promised pardons of the people who committed violence in his name on January 6, 2021, the ones who earned themselves that bronze statue of Nancy Pelosi's desk on the National Mall that briefly memorialized the physically repulsive and scatological nature of their actions inside the Capitol. I mean, the argument now appears to be in Republican circles not whether Trump is going to issue pardons to people who took part in that attack on the Capitol, but just how many pardons he's going to issue. Will he pardon them all, or will he just pardon some of them? That has led publications as diverse as the Huffington Post and the Wall Street Journal editorial page to try to resurface the details of the crimes for which some of these people were convicted, to try to make it seem, even to Trump, even to Trumpist Republicans, like maybe these convictions were sound and should stand. Quote, Andrew Tate pepper-sprayed police officers defending the Capitol on January 6, 2021, and hit one with a metal whip. He is serving 74 months at a federal prison in Beaumont, Texas. Christopher Alberts carried a loaded 9mm pistol onto Capitol grounds that day and hit police officers with a wooden pallet. He's serving an 84-month sentence at the federal prison in Milan, Michigan. Stephen Cappuccio held his cell phone in his mouth so he could beat an officer using both of his hands, including with the officer's own baton. He's doing 85 months at the federal prison in Forest City, Arkansas. All three will be back on the streets if Donald Trump, the man who incited them and some 2,000 others to attack the Capitol in the first place, follows through on his oft-repeated pledge to pardon the January 6th insurrectionists. Of those serving a year or more in prison, a full 57% are there following a conviction in cases involving an assault on a police officer. In all, 83% serving a year or more were convicted of committing an act of violence, which means that with few exceptions, the only people Trump could release from prison with his pardons are those who attacked a police officer, possessed weapons or explosives, or were convicted of some other violent felony. Are those going to be the ones he springs? Here was the deeply conservative Wall Street Journal editorial page today. It's titled, Trump's Pardon Promise for January 6th Rioters. Does it include the ex-meth trafficker who brought a metal baton and swung it at police? Quote, on December 20th, a prison sentence of 48 months was given to a 31-year-old man named Joshua Lee Atwood, who pled guilty to assaulting law enforcement. He emptied a can of pepper spray at police, beat them with a pole, and pelted them with objects such as a metal scaffolding pipe. He yelled that the cops were pieces of... The prosecution's sentencing memo says his criminal history includes a pending felony case for an alleged 2023 stabbing. On December 17th, meaning last month, a 60-month sentence was given to Michael Bradley, age 50, who apparently went to the Capitol on January 6th with his own metal baton in a hip holster. He swung it at police more than once. His list of priors includes a 2002 conviction for meth trafficking. Also in December, a 24-year-old man got 9 months for having thrown an equipment container lid that beamed a cop, causing momentary loss of consciousness and a suspected concussion. A 41-year-old man who wore body armor on January 6th pled guilty to scuffling with police, including trying to seize an officer's baton while shouting, "Come out here, B-word." Other active cases include accusations of ramming the police line, punching cops, and walloping riot shields with a baseball bat. The Wall Street Journal editorial page continues, quote, this was the brutal reality of the Capitol riot that many want to forget. Pardoning such crimes would contradict Mr. Trump's support for law and order. Oh, and it would send an awful message about his view of the acceptability of political violence done on his behalf. Now, as I mentioned, this is the Wall Street Journal's editorial page, deeply conservative. I would take issue there with their characterization of Mr. Trump's support for law and order. He has repeatedly praised the idea of violence in his name for every year that he has been in public life. And so I would take issue with that. That said, that last line I read there from the Wall Street Journal is absolutely correct. Quote, it would send an awful message about Trump's view of the acceptability of political violence done on his behalf. The acceptability of political violence done for him, in his name. This January 6th, yes, we have got very blunt evidence of the profound difference between the Democratic Party offering Democratic competition, win or lose, and the Republican Party's threat of violence to hold power. And yes, there is also the unnerving and occasionally unsettling fight to remember what actually happened, to be real about how disgusting it all was, while the Trump movement and the Republican Party and the conservative media tries to say the January 6th attack was really just a bunch of heroes who were so peaceful and loving, and they've just been wrongly persecuted for doing nothing wrong. The effort to remember and to stick to the truth of what happened there and not be gaslit and lied to that it was some sort of day of love and peace is unnerving and unsettling, and yes, occasionally hilarious. But there is also a very instrumental and practical question at hand this January 6th, which is what happens to the future of political violence in our country in the very short term, in like the next year, if the people who committed violence on Trump's behalf are sprung from prison by him and celebrated as vindicated heroes who did nothing wrong, starting 2 weeks from today when Trump takes office again. Think about this in big picture terms. Why does a leader who celebrates violence against his critics and his enemies want not just a government, not just the state to do his bidding? He also wants his mob. He also wants his paramilitary groups, people who have proven themselves willing to commit violence on his behalf. Why does he want the mob? Why does he want his paramilitary groups? Why does he want his violent ex-cons? He wants to set them all free at the start of his presidency so they can do what for him? The idea that there is permeability between violence and politics, that an incoming president might want a deniable, non-government violent force that he can activate or direct to do his bidding. That what is supposed to be civic hallowed ground might be fouled by rioting and looting and people doing what they did in Trump's name on January 6th. That is supposed to repel us and disgust us indelibly. We are never supposed to acclimate to that. But the Trump side has, and this artwork was temporary. And so now, this January 6th, what should we be prepared for next, with 2 weeks left before he's back in power?
It is time for Money Power Politics. Tonight, what a difference 4 years can make. In 2021, major companies denounced January 6th and pledged to withhold donations from those who disputed the 2020 election results. Now, many of those very same companies are giving big money to Donald Trump's inauguration fund. And here's what's interesting. The Wall Street Journal points out that in some cases, this marks the first time in over a decade that they're supporting any inauguration fund. Lauren Hirsch is here to discuss. Steelbook reporter for the New York Times, and Rebecca Ballhaus, reporter for the Wall Street Journal's investigations team. She covers campaign finance, politics, and the Trump White House. Rebecca, you've been reporting on this very subject. January 6th, 2021, companies, all sorts of them, said this is not about politics. This is about democracy. They saw a red line and they said, we are out. What specifically changed?
I mean, I think it's very clear what changed, and that's who's in power. And so on January 6th, 2021, Biden had been elected. I don't think anyone at that point thought that there was any real chance of Trump mounting a political comeback in the way that he has. And I think in the lead up to the election, and certainly in the wake of it, we've seen companies realize that they need to be a part of the policymaking process in this White House, and that the way they see to do that is to go to Mar-a-Lago, meet with Trump, and make a hefty donation to his inauguration fund.
You've got some reporting, though, Rebecca, that Trump's team isn't just saying that donations are, for the inauguration. They're really a mea culpa to Trump to say, I'm sorry I wasn't here for you, with you these last 4 years. I want to be in your good graces again. Explain.
Yeah, I think that that's certainly been made very clear by Trump's aides and also by Trump himself. I mean, Trump is clearly relishing all the attention he's been getting at Mar-a-Lago. He's been saying, you know, everybody wants to be my friend now. And I think for his aides, some of them, you know, are even rolling their eyes at this idea that corporate CEOs think that they can make the last 4 years go away by making a donation to his inauguration fund, especially you know, one of about $1 million or so. So I think they're clearly relishing this sort of rush to get back in his good graces. And it certainly remains to be seen how effective some of these efforts will be. But it's been pretty striking. I mean, to give you one example, after January 6th, Facebook had suspended Trump's account, accusing him of inciting violence. And then just a couple of weeks ago, Mark Zuckerberg was at Mar-a-Lago and put his hand over his heart as the January 6th choir is singing over the loudspeaker the national anthem. And to be fair, they didn't announce who was singing, but I think it shows you sort of just how far things have come.
I want to stay on exactly that, Lauren, because social media companies after January 6th were under huge scrutiny. All of those CEOs were in the hot seat. Questions about best practices, content moderation, hate speech. Was there content on their platforms that led to January 6th, right? It was after January 6th, Donald Trump got tossed from Twitter, right? Fast forward, Zuckerberg wasn't just there giving money 2 weeks ago, okay? They don't even have content moderation teams. Elon Musk obviously runs Twitter. He is Donald Trump's #2 first man in, you know, it's like, I don't want to say he's the first lady. You know, I mean, he obviously running Doge. And just today, Meta announces Dana White, right, head of the UFC, on their board, and their new head of policy, which is, you know, all the DC jam, is a GOP strategist. I mean, it's extraordinary how much it's changed for social media companies. And it's not like they had a bad last 4 years.
These companies didn't want to be involved in politics, and they kind of felt pushed into it, particularly, you know, during the pandemic when there was already a lot of social uprising. There was a lot of pressure from their employees at that time to take a voice. That's gone now. It's a completely different environment. The pandemic has ended. There's DEI backlash. You know, the employees are much quieter now.
But why are the employees quieter, right? Because lots of CEOs 4 years ago, they don't want to talk about politics. They just want their employees happy, their customers happy, and their shareholders happy. But 4 years ago, even if they liked Trump, wanted to keep their mouths shut because they were going to face huge employee backlash. Where has that gone?
Well, think about it. They would go on Twitter to complain if they were unhappy at work. Now, who owns Twitter? Or X? It's Elon Musk. And let me tell you, I think a lot of CEOs are almost as afraid of Elon Musk as they are of Trump. And you know, if they do something that will upset Trump, you could have Musk going after them. So the dynamics are changed and the pressure points have changed. And I think you're seeing that playing out in how they're maneuvering this situation.
Rebecca, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's just an incredibly different environment, sort of in the same way that you saw, you know, Democrats agree to show up to this inauguration and people sort of just putting up less of a protest this time around, sort of, you know, indicating that they feel like his win this time is more valid because of the election results. I think, you know, these CEOs just feel like they don't have any choice but to sort of become a part of this process and get in the mix.
But isn't it strange, because January 6th, right, take politics out of it, they all said that January 6th was about democracy. And it's not like, right, most companies out there for the last 4 years, look at their stock. Fortune 500 companies did extraordinarily well over the last 4 years. So what is it that they're looking to get away from? Is this really a DEI play, or is it is it a DEI rejection, or is it they simply don't want to deal with the wrath of Donald Trump?
There's also something really practical, which was January 6th. Trump had clearly lost the election, and they were hoping he would leave after having lost.
Forever.
He's now won the election. He has Congress, and they're kind of looking at it very practically, saying he's going to be in office and we need to work with him.
And he's vengeful.
Yes. Or, you know, some people would say he's transactional or some combination of the two. So,
I don't think he's vengeful is an overcharacterization. He seeks revenge on people who don't stand with him.
And I think, you know, the first time Trump was in office, a lot of CEOs didn't know how to navigate that. They didn't know how to navigate his particularly transactional nature. Now that he's back, I think they've been to the show. They know how it works. The social pressure is a little bit less. And so they're just kind of buying a ticket, literally, actually.
Donald Trump's first day in office is exactly 2 weeks away. So will he actually do what he's been telling journalists he plans on doing? And if he does pardon the violent January 6th rioters, and you heard him say that he would do that, what exactly is it going to cost him? Joining us now, host of Radio Atlantic and co-host of the Atlantic's narrative podcast, We Live Here Now, that explored the leaders of the Justice for January 6th movement, Hanna Rosin. Really good to have you.
Thank you.
This is it's a big topic. Who Donald Trump is going to pardon, how far he's going to go with it. He's said everything. He plans on pardoning all of them. He's also said he's going to take it on a case-by-case basis. We're not going to know until he does it. I guess what is at stake here for him? I know there's different stakes. We'll get to those in a moment. But what do you think is at stake for him politically if he decides to pardon the violent people?
It's trickier than it seems. The first thing to note is the majority of Americans have said that they're against the pardons. And so it's not as easy as it looks. He's made some promises to what's now coalesced as the January 6th community. That is the family and friends of people who have either pled guilty or been charged with crimes related to January 6th. He's been clear to them, but not all Americans agree with him. So it's a little complicated what it means for him politically.
Some of these folks that he has talked about pardoning, the violent ones, had violent records before what happened on January 6th. I mean, they're not exactly people who walked in there with clean hands. They also all went through trials and were either pleaded guilty or were convicted by a jury of their peers. Do you expect to see any discomfort among Republican lawmakers if he decides to go far with this, if he decides to let off the hook folks who got into it with police officers, who were pushing against the barriers, who were maybe carrying handcuffs or spraying pepper spray? Again, the violent ones. Do you think any Republican lawmakers are going to stand up and say, maybe this is going a little too far?
It depends how you define the violent ones. You just listed a whole bunch of things which are very different. So the definition of assault, which a lot of people have been convicted of, ranges from, actively hitting a police officer with a flagpole and being caught on film doing that, pushing a barrier, so it just depends. It depends what the video shows. It depends what you've actually done. Now, note that the majority of people who have been both convicted and who pled guilty have been charged with misdemeanors. So would you consider those violent? Would you consider shoving a barrier against a police officer violent? Some are very clear, but the majority are not very clear. So I think there's a lot of ways that Trump could spin this. People tend to believe him, and he could get up there and say, oh, this person just, what was their weapon? They picked up a flag. Is that a weapon? So it sort of depends on how he spins this. There are some who are very clearly violent and caught on film being violent. I doubt it would be very hard to get away with pardoning those people, but they're a minority of the people convicted.
The We Live Here Now podcast is fascinating, Hanna, and you really were able to go into the mind of some of the January 6th rioters, but also some of the family members associated with them and the way that they've been holding vigils and the way their lives have changed. I wonder if you could bring us into the heads of even one person, of what it means for them now that Donald Trump won, and what their lives might look like now, what sort of community member they might be.
Yeah, I think their expectation is that their lives will go back to normal, that their family members will come home, and that everything will go back to the way it was. Now, I think the thing no one's talking about is a pardon doesn't say you weren't guilty. A pardon, the Supreme Court has ruled, is a kind of intimation of guilt. So I'm not sure how that then continues forward into the rest of your life. Are you still considered a felon? Are you still considered a January 6th? Or is it still hard for you to get a job the way it has been for a lot of people who have pled guilty? I mean, generally, the way that presidents have used pardons is kind of as a large act of mercy, not as an idea that you didn't do what you were accused of doing, which is what President Trump is intimating. So I'm not sure how the rest of society will accept the January 6ers, even though their expectation is, look, this shows that we're innocent. This shows we never did anything wrong. We were just participating in a day of love and peace, which is what Trump has called it. We are not criminals. that's not actually what a pardon says about you. So
Yeah.
we'll see how it unfolds in their lives compared to what they expect.
Yeah. What about the radicalization? You document the way people went into prison and the way they came out and the way in which they were held together. Usually when you go into prison, we've had this discussion, you're not amongst people who you committed crimes with. You're separated out. But with the January 6 rioters, because they were in a D.C. prison, because their crimes were different or potentially dangerous, it was potentially dangerous to have them part of the general population. They were all packed in together, and in that group, they radicalized each other. How might that look on the outside if Donald Trump chooses to pardon the ones that got harder in prison?
Yeah, I mean, the Justice Department did many things right in this investigation. It's the largest investigation in history, but putting them all together really gelled them as a community. You know, it created the January 6ers as a community with unified interests, unified purpose, and they have been radicalized and they have all this energy against what they call the deep state. So I'm not really sure what happens to all that energy if they're pardoned. Does it just fizzle, or do we continue to live with the January 6ers as a community who are politically legitimate? It becomes just one of those things that are normalized under Donald Trump.
Yeah, and I wonder how the FBI going forward might see these folks. I mean, the FBI, which worked hard to gather them up and to prosecute them and to investigate them, the FBI, how it might behave or what the goals might be under Donald Trump's administration and potentially a Kash Patel at the head of it.
Yeah, there's been conspicuous silence, I would say, from the unions, you know, both the police unions and in general, like the organizations that support law enforcement about these pardons. A lot of reporters have reached out to them and they have declined to comment. I think it's really tricky because on the anniversary of January 6th, you will hear and are going to continue to hear from police officers who were badly injured. There have been a few police officers who took their own lives. I mean, police officers really suffered and their lives were also destroyed and their families were also destroyed as a result of January 6th. So I really do think there'll be pushback if Donald Trump just ignores the fact that police were the victims in this case, as we can see on screen right now.
Yeah, lots of roads to follow in the coming months. Hanna Rosin, thank you very much. Appreciate it.